Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And we're going to talk about Pichukichu. It's a Japanese term for chit-chat. And the intent was, by a bunch of architects, to have people explain what they were doing without taking a lot of time to do it. So this is a audience participation in a way. You've got 20 slides for 20 seconds, and they're programmed. And so if you want to speak about it, they have some tips. And so you ought to know about this event. They've run 20 of them in Champaign-Urbana, and this was the 20th, and they picked 12 of us to present. And if you go to the website, it's PECHA, capital K, UCHA. And it's hard to get your tongue around it for a while, but it's Pichukichu. And if you go to the website, you'll see that it's worldwide. I was intrigued to see that on the same day as I was presenting here, my folks on the Blue Mountains west of Sydney were having a same event, doing their things. The titles for these were various, and I'll get Dave to comment on some of this because we won't remember it all, but we rehearsed this and we went through pictures, and I think it's worthwhile for you to know what we were doing. You're on radio, so we'll be trying to explain what we were doing, but then when we go to video, we'll put pictures in, so you'll be able to get it eventually on Urbana Public Television or on YouTube. But the topics were as follows. First was gender swap. Next there was obesity. Next there was constructing a character with the aid of computers, I think. Nina Paley was My Car-Free Life. I was there with Prairie. And then there were two women speaking about women's opportunity to do things, especially in science. Then there was a break. Then a young woman told about getting access to art, and she decided to do art despite the fact that she could have done better perhaps if she was regular, but she had been very glad to be irregular. And there was a young woman who suggested that it was very good to be transparent. If you have difficulties, share them so that you can share other people's transparencies. Brandon Dolman was a strong man. He lifted things. And Brian Mertz was talking about copyrights and how copyrights can destroy your creativity and lock things up so that you can't share them. And then Ralph Rosa spoke about being 5 feet tall, and a little of the opposite to being heavy and having to deal with the public. So Kelly White was the heavy person that who's also the Arts Council of 40 North administrator. So you get an idea of the lineup. There are some suggestions because you this is not easy, folks. You have to take what you want and put it into a few minutes. So some of the tips that are given to you are: have a theme. Make sure you're passionate about your theme. Don't wibble wobble about things. There's a story. Have a beginning and an end. Watch other Pechakucha presentations. Storyboard your ideas. Spend more than 20 seconds on one point. Like, it's okay to flow over your 20 seconds to if you're going to explain something. Don't put any text on your slides because people aren't going to read it that quickly. And rehearse and rehearse and rehearse so that you can do it quickly. Then behind the scenes there is how do you get the pictures to the Pechakucha organization. Well, we started off with Word and inserting pictures into Word. Then we gradually got into PowerPoint, and we sent our 20 slides by PowerPoint. And we had to do it fairly quickly because we didn't have a lot of notice about this, so you had to look at your slides and decide, well, that's the best we can do with that one. It's a matter of going and doing and completing. So then we have to have pixel size. So I sent a PowerPoint to the organization, and it was too small. So they were just there pumping it up to the right size, and we got it there. And we reordered a few things, and that got into the computer. So I was very pleased. And so there's an organization behind this. It's mostly volunteer. And mostly the programs are fairly free of any expense. In this case, there was a charge because they have to pay some people to do computer work, to set up the stage. It was in the Virginia Theater, which had a huge screen, and you had to have an organization so that you had a podium you could speak from, or you could take a wireless mic and move around. So I was surprised that there were more people there than I thought there would be. I thought sometimes this gets to be friends and relatives who know each other. The MC was a guy named Easterbone, who's a young, recent graduate. He had the opportunity to go on to the law, but he's a comedian, and he did pretty well. This is a lot of this is spontaneous, so you have to be prepared to go with the flow. So let's run through our own thing. I'm sitting here with a hat on because I used my name, Prairie Monk, as a symbol for a lot of this work, sort of a totem pole for Prairie, and so I wear a cape that denotes that I might be a friend of Francis of Assisi, and that Francis of Assisi might care about the Prairie that we don't have anymore. And so let's go with the slides. And David has a a copy of this, and we might intersperse a little bit. We won't be confined to 6 minutes and 40 seconds. We'll maybe even able to put 1 or 2 more pictures in when we go to do video. So we started out with 2 maps of the prairie that was in 1820 and the prairie that isn't in the present time. David found these 2 slides and we put them up, and so that gave people an idea of how little there is left of the heritage prairie. The second slide was drainage. What we did was especially Western Europeans that knew how to drain, came here and drained the soils, and they're very rich soils, glaciated soils, and that is a picture of a meandering drainage ditch, and there's a little bit of prairie left along those ditches. Then we talked about railroad beds and odd places being available for prairie remnants, and we pictured a gravel pit prairie that represents the 20s, and then we morphed into saying that there were 100 prairie broadleaves, about 6 grasses, and they sort themselves out according to niches, depending on moisture or soil type or 100 other factors. Might include burning, which is a typical part of prairie maintenance, because lightning used to strike and burn the litter, and the creatures and the plants got used to doing that, so they're adapted to burning. So if you have a prairie and you don't burn it, then it's going to decrease in its viability. We looked at a prairie clover nestled in amongst grasses, mentioned that the grasses may have as many as a mile of rootlets, whereas other plants are deep-rooted, including the clover. Then we went to a compass plant, reminded people that the compass plant had some history. Its leaves face north and south to prevent summer sun from boiling out the water that's in the plant, but it also helped people know what was north and south in a prairie where there was no indication of buildings or mountains or scenery that could give them an idea of what was north or south. We mentioned that the biochemicals in this plant may be useful for a disease you don't know about in 500 years' time. This is your gene pool. It's your history and your ambiance. This is part of your heritage for this region. We mentioned that on South 45 we have a prairie between the highway and the railroad, and it has been worked over some recently because there's been huge power towers installed there, and that has worked over the top of prairie, but prairies are deep-rooted and they've been coming back, so we mentioned that, and that whole area, the roadside has been widened from 2 lanes to 3 lanes to 5 lanes, and some of those plants have gone around the corner to Lake Park, where we have a reconstruction prairie. Then Hutland Pathways, which was the organization we were representing, bought a railroad bed, and had the temerity to put in a map because people could see it. And David had put up larger letters here so the audience could see it. And we mentioned that eventually we'd like to have bicycle ways that are also greenways between Danville and Champaign-Urbana, Monticello, Decatur, and Clinton. So we'll probably leave that map up a little longer for you to see. We went to a specimen railroad bed where you could see the trees on the abandoned railroad bed, and roadside there was we mentioned that mowing often takes out a lot of the prairie that's along the roadside. And then we morphed to a slide that indicated really zealous mowing over our railroad right-of-way. And we have similar problems with herbicide. The power lines especially are herbiciding, and that really takes our prairie that we bought railroad line for. It used to be they would cut trees that might short to the power lines, but in this case they're found herbicide, and they're using very strong herbicides all around the world, and so we have some thoughts about that. There are other things we did with this railroad bed. The city of Monticello put in an attractive bridge trail. It went over the Sangamon on a truss bridge, and that is a popular trail in the area. It also acts as a demonstration for other possible trails. We mentioned seed collection, and the fact that some of that seed would go to storage in Minnesota and then come back to within 100 miles of where it was picked. We inserted a slide and then dropped it out that showed Peter Schramm sowing seed just near to Parkland College on North Duncan Road. Going west, we indicated that we'd had a lot to do with saving 30 acres of a picnic ground that was a picnic ground in the horse area when you couldn't take horses more than about 15 miles from town. This site is owned and worked by the Piatt County Forest Preserve, and it is now a nature preserve with wonderful understory herbs and bottomland forest. As you go further west, the trail goes from Lodge to DeLand to Weldon to Lane to Weldon Springs to Clinton. And we moved along that, indicated one spot at Weldon where our land has been invaded, and it's been very helpful that farmers have understood what we were doing with trails and railroad beds and prairie preservation, but just a few feel the need to put in crops because that is the highest and best use as far as they're concerned. The prairie looks, frankly, kind of weedy, and often it is because weeds and trees have invaded the territory. We hope that public pressure will change the attitudes to the prairie preservation. We don't like to lose our only relatively undisturbed soils and microorganisms and prairie plants. Then we wanted to mention Rail Banking Act. We'd bought a railroad bed before the Railroad Banking Act. The railroaders were having a rough time. They were losing more railroads than they'd like to see abandoned. So they made a deal with Congress to create a Rail Banking Act And they noticed that hikers and bikers were buying these trails for recreation and for greenways. And so they made a deal with the hikers and bikers to create a trail, a public use trail, that would preserve the railroad beds. Those railroad beds were so expensive that you could never replace them if you needed to put a train through in the future. So the federal government provided money, saved the bridges, which usually are mandated to be taken out at abandonment time, and to quiet the titles so that you don't have a trail where you have to go 7 miles around to get to the other side because there's a title that says it's reversionary. The railroad has the right to return if necessary. It probably won't happen a lot, but you might have the trail for 50 years, but we don't know what directions railroads will go in the future. This is a way of saving the corridor, and if use is required, it can happen. Notice that slide had prairie on it, on either side. The next slide showed the trees that had grown over. The federal support only comes if the locals want to buy the railroad bed, and it's taken 20 years for the community to buy the railroad bed, and in the meantime, trees have grown. You go in this general area, 6 miles east of Urbana, the railroad bed has been put up for bid for construction. So there's a nice bridge there going into St. Joe, and that contract has been bid. It's rather high, but construction will probably happen in the summer. The whole trail is 25 miles long, and we probably need a little map in there to suggest where it is. It's very straight and simple, and most of you know that corridor anyway. We want to remind you that the communities like St. Joe will benefit from this trail. There'll be restaurants and bicycle shops, and the ability of one town to communicate with another, to take a couple of miles along the trail as a hike, or it just, the community benefits are quite serious and well documented. And we ended up at the Vermilion end with a huge bridge over the Vermilion River, which will cost probably about $2 million to restore as a bicycle trail. But, and that is where the bridge drops into Kickapoo State Park, thus the name the Kickapoo Trail. The trail is owned by the Champaign County Forest Preserve District in Champaign County and by the Vermilion County Conservation District in Vermilion County. We ended by wondering what would happen to future generations and what prairie they would have left, because we keep losing prairie rather than gaining it. We do restoration work, but restorations don't have 10,000 years worth of construction after glaciation, so we're very concerned about remnants. And so we suggested that they work with Heartland Pathways, with Grand Prairie Friends, with Master Naturalists, and a whole bunch of organizations that are concerned about this topic. And we thank you. And that was the end of the 20 slides. David was in the audience, and so he may have some comments on how I got to handle this. It's a little concerning. It's not easy to do this, and that's the same for all the other presenters. You go up on stage not quite feeling bold, and So, do you have any comments?
Sure, I can agree with you. It was pretty obvious that there were some of the people who were up there may have known their material backwards and forwards, but once you're standing up there and looking at that audience and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm in public and I'm actually doing this in public, I think that it affected some of the folks up there, and you could hear it in some people's voices that there was a little bit of trepidation and, and how am I going to can I run now? Will they forget that they ever saw me or something like that?
Some people were finished their comment on a slide and they had to wait a little bit for the next slide to come, and some people ran over the slides.
Yes, you mentioned one of the things that they told you is don't expect to have just 20 seconds per idea. You only have 20 seconds per slide. The implication is put several slides in a row that all apply to the same idea. Then you can stretch out. You can have an entire minute, and you did that. When folks go back and they watch this again, they're going to see 3 slides from the Pope Prairie. One that shows how sparse it is because it's just starting to regrow again. But then there are 2 close-ups that show purple plants and yellow plants that say, look, prairie may be very plain brown plants a lot of the time, but they can be just as pretty as the stuff that you go to the local, horticulture places and go to a greenhouse and pick up too. It's all in there. It's all prairie. And so you don't mow it under like some farmers will do just because it's not for the greatest good, because our rows of crops are so much better than this random, mishmash of stuff that's seldom even worth looking at. It's just this brown weed stuff. And how do you get that through to people?
The flowers are often small, and they're for a short period, whereas horticultural plants have been taught to behave differently. They flower for a long time, they're very showy, and they're rather large. So there's a lot of breeding in between a native prairie and the flowers that come from it.
Which I would think is... there's a value to that in the prairie, because you're right. If you look at a cornfield, for example, all of the stalks have been bred to be doing the same thing at the same time. They all tassel come July, and then they're all starting to get full height, and then they're all ready to be picked, because you don't want to be out there for 5 different days picking that one and then that one the next day and then that one over there, as opposed to a prairie where it's specifically designed itself. It has, but through evolution, has designed itself to spread out across an entire season, because who knows when the last frost will come. You don't want to have planted your corn and then there it goes, or the late rains and there you've just washed it out. The prairie is designed to get around that, because if you get frost, if you get inordinate amounts of rain or no rain at all for a long stretch, or like you say, lightning strikes, you know what? The prairie took care of itself to survive that. In some cases, crave it, need that. The fire strikes.
Deep roots stop erosion, and there's niches. Each plant has a niche. So the grasses have perhaps a mile of fibrous roots, and the opposite is a taproot of a compass plant that might be the size of your thigh. All tapping into cottonwoods would tap into the aquifers underneath. So, yeah. It's an ecosystem, and we don't always know what that ecosystem is. It may be that you're looking at 1820, but there may have been a storm in 1820 that wiped out part of the prairie. There may have been fire. There may have not been fire. There may have been humans that arrived and dealt with taking over the prairie as a commodity, or taking over the soil. So afterwards, we took photographs, and other people took photographs of the crowd that was there, and it was very pleasing. So these Pichacucha events are held probably 3 or 4 times a year, and they're quite interesting and free, and you learn a little bit very quickly about what people do, and so the whole point of this is to communicate in that way. It doesn't stop you from communicating in a very different way at a later date. For instance, who owns this stuff, who works it, who uses it in another generation, where is it, why is it, what are the biochemicals in it, these are all questions that are subject to deeper thoughts. In some cases, we are interested in historic railroading, so we hope to return some of this bed to railroading, and that just that one topic is involves elevators, it involves mainline railroaders, historic railroaders, the places that you go by like Shady Rest, or so this is just a starter to other things. And we're finding that there are organizations, the University of Illinois and its Extension Division has created a master gardener and then later a master naturalist. And those organizations have volunteers that have to do in order to get their certificate, they have to do so much intern work. And so these people by the hundreds have been going out there and doing interesting things, and often they learn a lot from working in an experiential situation. So this is just a starter for all of that, and we appreciate what they're doing. I have a couple of specifics to say something about. In talking about railroad extensions to where we might allow we have railroaders who may not at this time want to extend to Champaign, but if we don't buy, borrow, beg, or steal the land at this time, then that will never be possible in the future. So what we're looking at is re-railing portions and doing battle to save another 3 miles. 4 miles re-railed. We hope we'll keep the rails on the 3 miles. But that involves, on the 4 miles, sleepers or ties. And normally on a main line there are 2,000 ties to the mile. So do we have trees enough to do that? Where do the trees come from? Do they come from the Amazon? Do they come from Canada or from Georgia? Do we grow the trees? So there are different ways of looking at ties. Some of them are steel ties. Some of them are concrete ties. And so Trudy Criven sent me a letter to give me an idea of what geopolymers are doing with ties. They probably haven't done it with ties, but they've done it with a lot of other things. They include fly ash, which has a chemistry of aluminum silicates that allow for water to be bonded in between or dried out according to what you want to do. And these polymers don't release a whole bunch of CO2, which is what concrete does as it matures. So it has some advantage in that it can use fly ash, which is a leaching material which is in mounds around power plants, fly ash by the acre. So could we perhaps use railroad ties that are made of polymer that can set without you having to wait 28 days for it to happen. It may set at a temperature that's lower than you might otherwise expect for concrete. You don't have to heat it up or anything. So there are a couple of papers there that we hope will perhaps come into the debate about what sort of ties we might use on the 4 miles that we're re-railing. That sort of really makes the point of how you look at things in a simple fashion, but behind it there may be detailed science of how you make such a polymer. Another one that we're looking at is a fire symposium. There is an Illinois Prescribed Fire Council, and it watches over burning. But this is a symposium that will be held on the 10th of February, and there's still room for interested people to be involved. It's a little on the technical side, but it will also involve a whole bunch of people who are prepared to be out there burning prairies, and they may not always know that prairies can burn fairly freely and fairly quickly and take off, and you have to watch the elder gentleman who might poop out with a heart attack trying to stand around and watch a fire, and then all of a sudden it takes off and you have to take off with it. And it sometimes will move faster than you can move in a pickup truck. So there, I assume, and I got a list of the people that are coming, and there's like, I would guess at least 100 people there, and they're a mixture of people who are young and interested in burning, and some of the older ones who've lived with prairies for 30 and 40 years and know what burning does to a prairie and how you have to be careful not to have it select the rude and crude plants that enjoy burning, and then you can make a burned prairie syndrome where you have rather coarse plants, and the refined plants that don't really enjoy burning are lost to burning. So some of these papers will be, it's a one-day conference, but Anderson will be there from Bloomington. He's done a lot of research on this sort of thing. It sometimes relates to animals. How do you, for instance, if you have a prairie and you've just burned it and it nicely shoots, do you have 60 deer on that eating all the shoots, so then you lose all your charming plants that you're trying to save? So there's some reason for good husbandry about this burning. Perhaps I should look at some of the titles of the seminar. Natural weather services. That if you're going to burn, and you burn when it's windy, and you have a bunch of shopping centers across the road, like on Route 45, then you're going to be in a mess, because you're going to have a lot of people who are allergic to smoke, and you're going to have a possibility that some litter will lift up with a fire terminal and raise up and move over the shopping center and drop down and cause a conflagration. So it's very hard to burn that sort of prairie. We sometimes simulate it by mowing it, but that doesn't give you the credential of bursting the seed that has grown used to being fired, and the fire will burst the seed, and the seedling will come out and grow, and it needs the fire to actually start it. So just mowing is not really a good simulation. But you need the weather service to tell you what is going to be 15-mile-an-hour wind and less, so that you can burn. You burn just a little piece, but perhaps 10 by 10, to see how the wind is moving. Is the wind moving straight, or is it a type of wind that's going to turn around and go in the other direction and give you problems? So you need the weather services. You need the fire people to be trained to know what a prairie fire is. It's axiomatic that fire departments put out fires, but these days we ask fire departments to be prepared to start fires. It's called a controlled burn, and that requires some education. Roger Anderson will be talking about some of the work that he's done over the years in McLean County with Funk's Grove, which is like a prairie forest remnant. There'll be discussions of Shawnee Forest Fire Program. Burning forests are slightly different from burning prairies because there's a lot of litter underneath it. The fire scuds across, and you can't really have a huge fire, so you'll be cautious about going into somebody's Douglas fir agronomic forest, because those pine trees can catch a fire, and then the fire is so large that it is a crown fire, and it takes those trees out altogether, and that means you have lost you're not only lost your prairie to agronomic forests, but you've lost the agronomic forest too. So it gives you an idea that you might be able to belong to it. There's some cost to it, but there's room for additions. If you're a fire person and you would like to join, I think you will be welcome, because we do need people who know how to use the tool of fire. We've got a quarter of an hour here, so what I want to do is I've been reading a book by a guy named Cronin, and it's been very interesting. I will give you a rough idea of what it's about, and later I'll do a more detailed summary of this sort of report. This gentleman grew up in Wisconsin with a father who was a historian, and his father taught him to observe, and to observe change, and to ask questions, and to look at something like a forest in Wisconsin, and what was happening to it, and how did the change as humans came about. And he went through various degrees and eventually ended up in the East. And he took his principles of Wisconsin growing up to New England, and he first of all wanted to know what was the ecology before we settled, and that is not a uniform thing. It's not as if you came to New England and it was all the same. First of all, there is a temperature gradient. You have southern New England is much warmer than northern New England. So, and there are wind patterns and offshore current patterns. The Dogger Stream goes up the east of the coast of America and ends up in the channel in England. It's called a Dogger Bank, and so it has a lot to do with the temperatures and the seasonality. So, and you have to deal with glaciation, and some parts of the region were not glaciated, and so there are pockets of very different ecology. You might have a sandy soil somewhere else and a very deep, damp soil somewhere else. And then you start to think about the the animals that were there, and this was a huge area, and the animals somehow managed to keep themselves in a population that was fairly low. You didn't have an outburst. If you did, the nature, the ecology handled it. For instance, if you have lemmings and they increase their population, there's a thing called a J-curve, which means that you can increase that population up to a certain point where there's not the food and to maintain it, or there may be a disease that hits, and all of a sudden it drops to like a J, and you're left with just a modest few lemmings. Well, that sort of things can happen on different soils. So the next thing that the author looked at was the impact of Indians on this corridor. So the Indians to the north were dependent on hunting, the deer and the moose and the wildlife that was there. They knew how to live with wolves and other mammals that were there. To the east there was fishing, and you would have mussels and earwives and creatures that were in an ordinate abundance. You could put your hand in and scrape up a whole bunch of fish. So the northern Indians were used to this sort of abundance, but they didn't overuse it. But then they knew how to deal with winter and the inability to follow animals, some of them hibernating and the like. They got very clever at knowing how to find the characteristics of certain creatures. They would know that a beaver would make a beaver village and could put in a dam that would be huge enough to recreate the ecology, so that you then had swamps that could be utilized by migrating birds, so you know how to catch wildlife that way. You kept in balance. It was as if the Indian population didn't really own anything. They owned everything. It was this overall thing. The women would plant corn, but in order to plant corn they had to remove trees that had to do with edge timber, so that wherein you have an open field, you have a forest in the background, then at the edge of the forest there's more light, and so you have an edge timber. That's where animals come out into the field and hunt and then go back and they nest in the edge timber. But this was not huge, and it disrupted the ecology before European settlement came here, but it operated in a modest fashion. To the south, there was more of the cultivation. There was more corn. Corn was used because corn yields, and we know about that because we live with corn these days, and it does yield better than a lot of other plants. But they would plant corn with melons and other beans and other plants in between. So this was sort of like an ecology in itself, an ecosystem. It kept the organic matter there. It was very different from later settlement that came in and with row crops and really deep row crops, and they took out the microorganisms and the like. So the first thing that Cronin did was to document what the ecology was before settlers came, before Indians came. He wanted to point out that this was not a clear slate. This was something that you would have intermittent tornadoes. You would have changes in tectonics. This was a dynamic. This was a changing thing. And the Indians knew how to fit into that. If it came to be winter, they knew how to starve. They educated their bodies to not require as much food, as much heat as, for instance, an incoming European. Then he looked at what changes the natives had made, and we've mentioned some of those. Then the next thing he talked about was how Europeans came. And Europeans were looking for commodities. So the trees that the Indians were using in an ecological sense were to some extent used, but they weren't used in the sense of moving into a forest and taking out the tall pine trees for masts, because Europe had so decimated their forests that they had no trees that were tall enough to make masts on ships, and shipbuilding was big. So they looked for commodities like that. And they did start to take the example of Indian open spaces and grow corn, but then they would harvest the forests, and at the moment they didn't necessarily harvest the forests with sympathy. They would get to know what trees did what. The hickories would burn fuel fires. The pine trees were for lumber. But there were different types of pine trees. There were so they would cut the forest, burn it, and take out the trees that they wanted for lumber, but burn the rest. And then they would spread seed around amongst the trees so it would grow and take over, and that would change the ecology. And they would also do something that was pretty bad, was that they brought disease with them. So something like measles could take out hundreds of Indians at a time. And what had happened there was that as the Europeans were moving in, and this is the next chapter, is the Europeans had their own culture, which was a culture of capitalism and making money and being able to harvest beavers, for instance, and send them back to Europe, where this was a status symbol. So the status symbol for the Europeans was very different from the status of the Indians. There would be Indian leaders, but it was more gentle. It was more an association of a crowd rather than individual people wanting to own individual land and put up fences. So there was a legal difference between what an Indian thought was land and what the incoming people would think was land. They would do a deal with Indians, and the Indians would just assume that they were all now willing to share. But the Europeans weren't about to have that sort of sharing. They wanted land exactly, and eventually they had their own debates about whether hogs should roam freely or hogs should be corralled, whether your corn crop could be invaded by Indians or whether the corn crop should be fenced and not invaded by livestock like deer. So gradually the native livestock lost out, and the cows and the horses and the pigs came in, and the pigs were a problem. And so, and the population of Indians was lost to the point that they lost their social leadership. The leaders would die of measles or whatever, and so there was some interaction and some intermarrying, and but basically the two groups were very different, and that documentation has been interesting to me and a lot of other people. The articles were written in the 1980s, but it's still very relevant. And I think we're getting near to the end. So I don't have the book in front of me, but it has to do with land change. And this man was from the Midwest, and he's now a professor, might even be retired now, in the Wisconsin area. And he's wanted to point out in a more recent article that the fact that he got to do this work had a lot to do with happenstance. He happened to be in the right place when he happened to give the seminar, and happened to meet with someone who would publish his work. And so yes, life is by happenstance often, and we have to know that we can adapt to that. It does help if you happen to be in Ottawa Gorge and you happen to be an anthropologist and you happen to know what you're looking at. That's very helpful. So you get educated and do what you can, but a lot of life is happenstance. So I think with that we'll say this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And
Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.